Welcome to Elements of a Records Classification and Retention Schedule, or an RCRS. There are two essential elements that comprise a records classification and retention schedule, and you can probably guess what they are. The first one is classification, and the second one is retention, which includes disposition. We are also going to look at some bits and pieces that may or may not be included in a records classification system. And finally, we are going to touch on legal citations, very much neglected element of records classifications. All right, let's start at the beginning. What is classification? So I'm paraphrasing a bit here from the ISO 15489, where I say systematic identification, collection, and arrangement of file folders by categories. So those are the three pieces I'm going to work with here: is identification, collection, and arrangement. In the old days, and unfortunately in some places still to this day, they're divided up by subject. Often they're still divided up by department. But we are trying to divide them up now by function and or activity, and we'll talk about that as well as we go along. All right, so when I say collection, that means that we're using a classification code to collect file folders into some sort of hopefully functional category. And when I say identification, that's the method of determining the function of the file folder so that it can go into the correct category. Arrangement, within the category, we want to be able to group and name file folders consistently, often according to a naming convention. All right, so let's take a look at a few actual classification systems and see how they manage these elements of classification. And we're only looking at classification right now, so you won't be seeing the retention schedule side of the classification and retention schedules. All right. Here, the first one that we see is the British Columbia ARCS. That's the Administrative Records Classification System from 2011. We have a primary up top. So I'm going to use accounts payable files as an example across a few classifications. So the 925 is the primary code. The title of the primary is accounts payable. 925-20 is the secondary classification, and the secondary title is accounts payable files. So we've got a pretty significant clue there that this is where accounts payable files should go. That really shouldn't be an issue now with collection. Identification, not only are we going with the titles for identification, we also have this very nice includes invoices, receipts, statements, etc., to give you a clue that if it isn't accounts payable files, you're probably going to see these types of records inside that file folder. So that's a helpful hint. As for arrangement, this actually doesn't give any instruction on how to name or arrange files within this category, within this secondary. But really, we can forgive them for that because account payable files are really pretty straightforward for naming. Just below it, we see the current BC ARCS. It's almost exactly the same, except that they've added this covers statement. And a covers statement helps to kind of identify some of the activities that we might see within these files. So again, a little bit of an assistance to identify whether your file folder belongs in this accounts payable files. Now, just at the start here, you've heard me use the terms primary and secondary, and I'm going to throw them around a lot because that's the environment that I came from in the BC government, where we call things primary and secondary. Essentially, a primary is just a collection of similarly oriented secondaries. And in some cases, for example, in this primary, there is really only one secondary. So it's a primary for accounts payable, and there's a secondary for accounts payable. Excuse me. The important thing to keep in mind is that a secondary is the level at which collection, classification, retention, and disposition happens. Secondaries can also be called a number of other things: record series, categories, etc., etc. One of the things that I didn't show in this slide were the scope notes for the primaries. So in the BC government, they're really strong on having a scope note after their primary code and title. They'll have another description of what you're going to see in this primary. So that's another assistance in identifying files that go into this structure. All right. Now for something that looks a little different, but really it isn't. This is the classification for the city of Winnipeg. So I thought maybe it would be fun to kind of, since this is ARMA Winnipeg, that we would pick on the city of Winnipeg a little bit and take a look at their classification system. And fortunately, and very nicely, it is publicly available online. All right. So they have an accounts payable, as we see here. I'll call it a secondary for now. So the secondary code is 2.03, and it's in a primary. I'll call it a primary for now. 2.00 departmental financial management. Okay, so very similar concept, just structured a little bit differently. That's fine. And again, the includes or the identification process involves a nice description of what we're probably going to find in these kinds of files. And they also added a little function description here, which I kind of like the idea of that. They, again, just like the BC government, do not give any instruction on how to name file folders collected under this category. And from what I saw, they didn't really do it anywhere in their categories. All right. One of the things that you may have noticed right off the bat is that it has accounts payable / receivable. This may be an encouraging evolutionary step towards a broad functional classification system. So keep that in mind for much later in this discussion. However, this might be an issue because there's no instruction given on grouping. So grouping and naming hasn't been covered here. So the implication is that potentially accounts payable and accounts receivable files will just be mixed together in a single category. I'm hoping and anticipating that the financial management staff actually do keep them separate in some way, perhaps a little AP record, AP note or an AR note. The reason why I'm hoping this is because I don't think the auditors will be real happy about having to wade through a bunch of file folders and determine whether it's accounts receivable or accounts payable. All right, I should notice I was doing quotes for secondary and primary, and that's because the city of Winnipeg does not use those terms. They use record schedule to cover the entire document, which is obviously very close to records classification and retention schedule, very close. And they use class of records rather than secondary. This is an important distinction for everybody to keep in mind because there are tons of variations on all these classification systems out there. And while the terms may differ, truly, they should be doing the same sort of thing. So the concept should remain the same, even when the terms are different. All right. And now let's take a look at how accounting payable files might be going into a current broad functional classification system. When I say broad functional, I do mean the concept of big bucket. I just do not like the term big bucket. So I prefer broad functional. All right, this primary is accounting, and the code is a non-numerical one like we've seen with the others. It's an alpha, so ACC, and then the secondary is accounting as well, and it's ACC-02. That's the classification code. So again, we have a very standard form of collecting. We see that they're going to be collected. Accounting payable files are going to be collected under the accounting secondary. Identification, again, is pretty easy. In addition to the function being stated in the primary and secondary titles, we have helpful descriptions similar to what we saw in the other systems. So, for example, I have the include statement here, which is very similar. And I also have AP. AP covers accounts payables, such as employee expenses, business travel, this sort of thing. So these two descriptions, you should be able to look at your file folder, recognize what belongs in there, and know that it's an accounts payable. All right. Very, very importantly, you can see that I've also got arrangement in here. So this is the first classification system that we've seen where I actually have group and name. Grouping is extremely important in broad functional classification systems because you can have a variety of very, very similar or slightly shaded versions of the same function. So accounting is the function. The focus is on accounts payable, accounts receivable, payroll, reconciliation, taxation, utilities, that sort of thing. So once we have them grouped by those different subcategories, then we go ahead and name the file folder by the specific account. So we have some really good instructions on how to arrange and how to name files that are going into this secondary. Did I need to put name file folder by specific account? Probably not. The finance people, like with the other classifications we saw, they probably know what they're talking about. They'll know what to name these files. But I don't like leaving things unsaid when just a few words can clarify anything. All right. So this is what you're going to typically find in a classification portion of a records classification and retention schedule. You're going to find that you're going to have collection, and it's going to be collected according to some sort of a classification code. You're going to have identification, which is reflected in, hopefully in the primary and in the secondary titles. We're also going to have identification in descriptions of the records or activities that we might see within file folders in this secondary. And then we have an arrangement, which is how do we group things and or name things within this category. All right. So that is classification in a nutshell. There's a couple topics that I want to continue on with while we're talking about classification. So the first one is the idea that records get filed into a file folder, and a file folder is what gets classified. If you talk about records getting classified, it is implying that you are managing records. You're managing basically your program at the document level as opposed to the file folder level. And there are some problems with it, and we'll actually see that further on when we get into the next couple of with the retention schedule portion. All right. So very quickly, if you have a new file folder and you want to classify it, what you do is you determine what is the function or the purpose of the information in the file folder. Okay. So if you were doing with a subject-based classification, you're going to have to do kind of two things. You're going to have to identify the function of the file folder and identify the subject of the file folder. And then you're going to have to find the kind of intersection where those two meet in the classification system. It's probably not that difficult. I mean, I'm making it sound confusing and difficult, but you'll probably have a classification secondary with the title that clarifies it. For example, you'd have something like budget planning, planning being the function, budget being the subject, and it'll probably be right there in the subject-based classification system, budget planning, and then you know where to place your stuff. But with subject-based classifications, you do need to watch out for what I call gaps and overlaps. Gaps are where you have a new file folder and you are searching through your classification system and you just can't quite find the right spot because things have been so targeted at a subject that you'll have a subject in your file folder that falls between two or more categories without quite fitting into any of them. That's a challenge. My recommendation there is to pick one that has the best retention schedule appropriate to the file folder. You also have to watch out for overlaps. So if you have a file folder or a document for that matter that potentially fits in multiple categories, you have to decide which one is the most appropriate, or you need to make a copy and put it into each, which is not always a bad idea. All right. If you're doing a function-based, once you identify the function, you put the classification on there, and then group it and name it. And you're good to go. So one thing I should mention before we move on is I'm using the term file folder, and I often use that term file folder as opposed to just saying file. And some of you can already guess, I'm sure, that the reason why I do that is because in the IT world, file means an electronic document, and that has leaked over into our jargon as well. So I tend to refer to a file as a file folder, and that applies whether it's a physical file folder or an electronic file folder, as long as we know that that is the level at which classification occurs. All right. So I wanted to give you some of the definitions from the ISO 15489, the 2016 version of these three terms. What is function, what is activity, and what is transaction? You're going to hear me mention function a lot, activity a bit, and transaction I won't mention very much at all. So what we're looking at here is that a function is a group of activities that fulfills the major responsibilities for achieving the strategic goals of a business entity. So it's not the best definition, it doesn't communicate great, but basically what we're looking for here is a major responsibility in an organization that is achieved through a number of activities. Okay? Activity. An activity is a major task performed by a business entity as part of a function. And it can be challenging if there's very few activities in a function. So for example, accounting, the activity is accounting for the most part. So the function and the activity is pretty much all of the function of that particular category. Then we have transaction. Transaction is this fancy definition, smallest unit of a work process consisting of an exchange between two or more participants or systems. The key takeaway here is that a transaction is captured in a record. So if we're talking accounting, we've got an invoice or we've got a receipt or we've got a check, or we've got something like that, and that is a literal transaction. Other transactions could be correspondence. That's a transaction. A draft is a transaction because you're presenting an unfinished work, perhaps to somebody else or to your future self. So we're kind of pushing the boundaries of the definition here, but this is a reasonably good definition. So let's take another example of these three. So if we take planning or plan development as the function that we're talking about, the different types of activities that we might see in achieving that function would be, you do some research, you might do some information gathering from other staff members or from other departments, you draft, you do reviews of the draft, and then you approve the draft. So these are activities that happen. Each one can have different transactions. So some of the transactions, again, this is a relaxed interpretation of the definition. You see some studies, some reports, submissions, and recommendations from departments or other entities, some correspondence. Obviously, you're going to have drafts, and you're going to have the final version of the plan. So I hope this is kind of making sense. There will be a test. No, there will not be a test. That's all right. We may be pausing here for a moment. All right. So we've talked about classification. That's the first major element of a records classification and retention schedule. The second most important is the retention and disposition, or the retention schedule, or the record schedule, however you want to call it. Basically, this is keeping file folders and then disposing of file folders. And very often we also refer to this as the life cycle of a file folder. Right. So the life cycle of a file folder is determined by instructions attached to a secondary. Okay, so we'll take a look at a couple of examples, but I wanted to kind of run through, first of all, the life cycle of a file folder. So the first step, of course, is you create a new active file folder. And in order to do that, you have to classify it. And when you classify it, you put the classification code on it. Bingo, you have a new file folder. The next step in its life cycle is to close an active file folder. Then you retain that closed file folder for a certain period of time. And finally, at the end of its life cycle, you dispose of the closed file folder. All right. So let's move on. What occurs when you close an active file folder? Well, in the classification system, you will often see like a code, or you'll be given an instruction as to how to close it. This is some of the common codes that I've come across. CY, of course, is calendar year, which means at midnight, December 31st, that file folder is closed. Fiscal year, midnight, March 31st, unless you use fiscal year as your calendar year, then it's December 31st. Event trigger is a very big one. So an event trigger, or an SO, and I'll explain that in a second, should always have an explanation in that secondary for the event that triggers the closing of a file folder in that category. So what I mean by that is a personnel file would have an ET that says perhaps when the employee is no longer employed. So that would be a trigger. Projects, when the project is complete. Policy, when the policy is replaced. So it needs to have a very clear explanation of the event trigger. All right, so I guess I need to address the SO. SO is It's still in use quite a bit, but it comes from an outdated concept of superseded or obsolete. And the idea was that the SO, if it had a definition in the secondary, then you would use that definition. If it didn't have a definition, you would use the concept of superseded or obsolete, which basically says you get rid of it when you want to get rid of it. Unfortunately, this worked reasonably well in the 80s when this was developed, but it has been poorly understood, inconsistently applied, and often a secondary that required a clear SO definition was never given one, even though it was obvious it needed one. So I'm not a big fan of SO, and it kind of, well, it triggers me. All right. Last odd one that you might see in a classification, this is becoming a bit more common, is PA. And that stands for permanently active, which means that the information in the file folder under this category is going to be maintained indefinitely in an active status. So it's not going to get closed, not unless something unusual happens. The only way that this would ever get closed is if the organization no longer exists, or if the organization no longer does this function. Then it will deal with the files that have been created underneath this permanently active category. All right. As a final note, I hope everybody already knows this, but it doesn't hurt to reiterate it. If a file folder is closed, it is not to be altered. Records are not to be removed or changed or added to the file folder. It should be in stasis. It would be wonderful if closed file folders could be put in a place where it had extra security, extra monitoring. This is easy to do with electronic records. You can build a read-only server and move closed file folders into a read-only server. A little bit tougher with physical files because you still need to access these quite often. All right. Let's move on to the next stage, which is retaining closed file folders. So you close the file. Now, how long are you going to keep it? So this is, again, a category in the classification system often. It's usually given in years. There are a few unusual circumstances where it might be months, or it might even be weeks for some things. If there is no retention period, this means it's a 0 or nil. I do not like the word nil as a placeholder, because nil means 0. But if you're trying to convert a classification system in order to input it into a database, an EDRMS or a file management system, nil is meaningless, and it makes the database crazy. So you have to change all of those to 0 anyways. So why not just have 0? I don't know, but nobody asked me when they were making it. Stay away from nil, use 0. All right. The retention period, these years are determined based on 2 things. The first one is the legal responsibilities. So if you have a piece of legislation that is saying you need to keep this for 6 years, then 6 years is the longest. If you have a business requirement that says we want to keep it for 10 years, then you keep it for 10 years. If the legal said 6 years and the business said 2 years, then you keep it for 6 years. You keep it for the longest period between the two, legal and business. All right. I very, very much stress the value of including in your classification the reason for that retention period. So if you're keeping it for 10 years because the business people said, oh, we need to keep it for 10 years, and they come back to you a number of years later and they go, why are we keeping this for 10 years? You can look at your reasoning and say, oh, you told us we needed to keep this for 10 years. And they go, yeah, we don't need to keep it for 10 years. 5 years is plenty. And then you might reduce it down to 6 years because you still got the legal responsibility for that. On the other hand, if it was based on a legal, so you have something that says we're going to keep it for 6 years because the law says so, and that law changes from 6 years to 2 years, you can now reduce it to 2 years because you know why you originally said 6 years. All right, this is actually a very important thing, and we might actually have some examples coming up that we can look at. All right. The last stage of a retention schedule is the disposition, disposing of closed file folders. So it's gone through its retention schedule, whether it was 0 or a number of years. In all cases, the disposition of closed file folders should be documented, should be approved through a real approval process, and the disposition should be applied under reasonably secured conditions, appropriate to the records. When I say appropriate to the records, I mean if you've got personal information or sensitive or confidential information, it should have an extra level of security when you're destroying these things or transferring them or storing them, that sort of thing. All right. Similar to the closing column, we have a number of codes that we might commonly see. The vast majority of file folders get destroyed. The vast majority, which is good. Otherwise, we'd be swimming in paper and electronic records. The next one is permanent retention, also referred to as full retention in some places. And that basically just means that the organization is going to keep that file folder forever. And when you're talking to people about this sort of stuff, mention that this is forever. This is not 10 years. This is not 100 years. It's not even 1,000 years. It's forever. So let that sink in. And that's part of the reason why the vast majority are destroyed. And only a few are selectively kept to be permanently retained. All right. The next one that we have is quite a rare situation, and that's a selective retention. Selective retention means that a few items, either file folders or documents or a combination thereof, will be permanently kept, and everything else in that category or secondary will be destroyed. All right. There's kind of 3 possibilities for SRs. The first is that significant file folders are going to be kept permanently. The kinds of things that we might typically see associated with this would be agreements, so very significant agreements. So, for example, a credit card agreement, you're not going to keep that permanently. But a collective bargaining agreement, you might keep that permanently. That might be worth hanging on to forever, assuming that we're not talking 18 binders of stuff. Investigations is another one. If you have a significant investigation or a legal matter, you might want to keep a permanent copy of a significant one. But insignificant ones, we don't want to keep forever. So that was file folders. Often we will also see a specific document or documents from each file folder that is within this category. This is quite common for development files for reports, plans, policies, these kinds of things, because once we get it approved, and once that development file is no longer needed, we might want to pull out that last final copy and keep that forever. Or we might take a copy of that final product and put it in a secured category that is going to be kept permanently, which is another, it's a different way of approaching the SR, which has a lot of advantages to it, actually. You still keep the copy in the development file, but a copy goes into another one as well for permanent retention. The third SR possibility is having significant documents out of significant file folders. So it's kind of a crosshatch of the two we just talked about. We might occasionally see this, for example, with marketing files. If somebody's developed a really nifty marketing campaign and they've produced a number of posters, you might want to keep copies of those posters permanently as kind of a history of your organization. But you wouldn't keep necessarily every news media report that goes out. We don't want to keep all that stuff. So in this case, it would be significant documents out of significant file folders. Right. So moving on, the last option here is transferring. That is giving over conveyance to another organization for your file folder. Typically, if we see this, it's transferring to an archives for them to maintain and to own and to handle as they wish. All right. So now let's take a look at some examples. And I'm going to walk kind of through those 4 steps. Even though we see 3 columns here, the first step is really getting that classification code applied to a new and active file folder. All right, so in this case, we have our lovely accounts payable files. This is made a return. And we're going to start by saying a new accounts payable file is classified with 925-20, and it gets a name. Done. So it serves its purpose, and it is closed at the end of the fiscal year. You see under active, it says FY. So December 31st, midnight, this file folder should be closed. Okay. Now we have some issues. The BC government system is not great. It was developed in the early 80s, and a lot of things that were good and beneficial in the early 1980s are no longer good and beneficial. They are clumsy and odd, and at points even illogical. So I originally wasn't going to go into it in too much detail, but I've seen this in multiple other classifications as well. So it's worth mentioning. Okay, so let's look at that active column. It says FY, and then it has +1 year. So the file closes at the end of the fiscal year, but it's still active for another year. This is confusing and illogical. The reason for this is that back in the 1980s, we lived in the world of physical files. There was no electronic file management, and there was no file folder tracking software, but that's another issue. The +1 was actually an instruction directly to file clerks telling them to keep the closed files in their offices for an extra fiscal year in order to make it easily accessible for financial staff to reference last year's information. So, therefore, even though the file was closed, it was active. Yeah, worked well in the 80s, not so much anymore. As a matter of fact, quite often in the records community, we would call that at the finger's length. Instead of active, it would be able to touch it immediately. Goofy. The semi-active column, moving on, is partially the retention of the file folder. So again, we've got an issue here. The BC government in the 80s considered the files at this stage to be semi-active, which is meaningless, really. All semi-active files were to be sent to storage because keeping them in cabinets taking up valuable office space in Vancouver and Victoria was considered cost prohibitive. So once that fiscal year plus 1 year was done, the file clerks would pack up the files and they would get sent off-site for storage. But this actually splits your retention period because you have 1 year in active and 6 years in semi-active, which would mean that the actual retention period is 7 years, but split between 2 columns. It's a little crazy making, but hang in there. All right, then we get to the final column, the final disposition column. This one, thank goodness, is very straightforward. We're going to destroy this stuff. So once the retention period is done, this stuff gets shredded. Because, of course, we're talking physical records, not electronic. All right. Now, you see I have a note there in the body of that secondary. This is a helpful explanation for how the retention period was calculated. Remember, I mentioned it's very helpful to have an explanation in order to know why a certain retention period was decided upon. This is an attempt to do that. But, of course, as with pretty much everything BC government, there's an issue with it. First of all, well, the issue is, you see, it says 8 years. Anybody see an 8 anywhere? Anybody adding up to an 8 anywhere? No, you're not. And quite rightly, because most of you can do math. So first of all, I've explained this multiple times to people in the BC government, the people who make these rules up. And I've pointed out, first of all, that a retention period should not start until the file is closed. So once you close it, it should be a 7-year retention period. So that note should say 7Y, not 8Y. But they're sticking with it. They like it. They're sticking with it. The rationale that they've given me behind this is that the time started from the beginning of the fiscal year, which is illogical. Also, it's mathematically impossible, because if you create a document on December 31st, and then you destroy it 7 years and 1 day afterwards, that's not an 8-year retention period. So it just, this one still drives me nuts all the time. All right. However, it is nice to have an explanation, even if it's wrong. It's still an explanation, and it could be used to be corrected in the future. There's also one mildly irritating thing, and you may notice this. It references the Limitation Act from 1996. That act was replaced in 2012. And this is supposed to be the current BCRs. So it is 11 years out of date. Yeah. Also, the new Limitation Act does not have a 6-year limitation period. So it's wrong. Okay. Calm down. Moving on. Let's take a look at Winnipeg. All right. So going to the City of Winnipeg records schedule, they have a column called retention and disposition. So it's quite different from the columns that we see with the BC archives or with the BC Orcs and Arcs. Here we can see that they approach it in a different way, but the concepts are still there. Of course, they've managed to throw in their own issues, so we'll walk through those as well. So step one would be off on that left-hand side. We've got 1.07. We have a new active file folder. We put 1.07 on it. That means it's a facilities booking records. Okay, starting place, active file folder. Now, the statement under the column retention and disposition says destroy 1 year after creation of record. So we need to work through that. And I'm gonna work through it by starting at the back end and working forward. So disposition, it's destroy. That's clear, that's easy, no problem. Bob's your uncle. The retention period, see, I'm working backwards from final disposition to retention. The retention period is 1 year. Okay. There isn't any explanation as to how this very short retention period has been decided upon. So I can't comment on the decision making. What I can comment on is that Manitoba's The Limitations Act, which came into force September 30th, 2022, has a basic 2-year limitation period. So I'm just saying it, that says 2 years. Now we look at this and we go, yeah, okay, the legal risk behind destroying it a year early is pretty small, probably not really a problem. Okay, I'll give you that. But I did see a few others where early destruction was going to be an issue. Now we come to the step where an active file folder would get closed. And in the other ones, we saw it was calendar year or fiscal year or some sort of an event trigger. What we've got here is a written out event trigger, but it is an odd one. And the reason why it's odd is because it basically says there's no such thing as an active record in 1.07. There's no active records. Records are closed the instant they're created because the time of their retention starts ticking immediately. Okay. I have some problems with this one. This is problematic for a number of reasons. So first of all, if you are maintaining and managing your records management program on a record by record basis, you either have to have a lot of record staff who are actively monitoring the filing repositories every day to discover records like this facilities booking records, which have expired, and then going through an approval process to destroy them every single day. If you're going to maintain a proper records management program. So gather up all these individual records and then destroy them using approved processes and signatures and tracking. That it's impossible. That is impossible. It could be made possible if you had some really nifty software, like a high-level EDRMS that actually, had document level disposition rules built into it, or SharePoint, where every time a record is created, a retention label is applied to it immediately. That could work. And that would be still not good records management. This is not a reasonable approach, in my opinion. If there's somebody here from the city of Winnipeg, I apologize. Give me a call. We'll have a chat. I'm not trying to pick on you. All right. There is a second implication behind destroying records individually, and that is if you have a file folder that tells a story, in this case about a facilities booking, and you destroy things record by record, you will start slicing off the information that comprises this file folder day by day. And you will at some point have an incomplete file folder with partial records contained within it. This is bad. All right. Now, again, the level of legal risk with this specific category or class of records is pretty small. So it's not a giant risk, but I did see other ones where, again, it was based on creation of record, and those other ones were much more legally risky. All right, so let's look at the current broad functional classification system. Again, we have a newly created plan development file. It gets classification code of gov-03. It's now a plan development file folder. Bob's your uncle. So we move on, and the very nice thing is that we have 3 columns here, which is reminiscent of the BC government's, but there's no bleed in between active and retain. Active is active, retain is retention. Okay. In this case, a plan development file is active until it reaches an event trigger. And you can see we have a definition built into the secondary. ET is when the plan is replaced and or the file folder is no longer required for reference purposes. So if you've got a new strategic plan, you're one from 3 years ago, you can start the clock ticking on that 5-year retention, right? And the 5-year is, I have a definition, I have an explanation. So it says the 5-year retention is reasonable for review and reference. That's obviously a business need. That is not a legislated need. If we wanted to have a legislated need built into that, we certainly could, but then that would take precedence over the business need. Then the closed file is kept for 5 years according to the retain column. And we have a final, excuse me, a final disposition of selective retention. Again, if you have an SR, you have got to have a definition down below. So this, in this case, it says file a copy of approved strategic plans, master plans, and budgets under Gov-01. So we are taking significant documents out of significant files, and we're putting them under Gov-01, which is one that says we're permanently retaining these. So this is a method of very clearly and directly identifying what we are going to keep permanently. Everything else gets destroyed. Okay. All right, I hope that has helped. So let's move on to the bits and pieces. This is the stuff that can make your classification system swell. And I will admit that sometimes I add a bit more than I really need into my secondary descriptions. So I'm going to go through these and kind of say, should they be in or should they be out of the classification system? All right, we'll go through each one, and I'm gonna move a little bit fast, but we're gonna get there. So notes and cross references. These are in. Notes and cross references within secondaries are amazing. They give more identification. They also very helpfully point you in the direction where you should be looking. So if somebody comes here going, I have a financial report, well, it's accounting, right? And you look at it and you go, wait a minute, for financial reporting and audits, use Gov-05. Oh, okay. And they go look at that over there, and then they're good to go. Very, very helpful. Even in a broad functional classification system, there is the potential for gaps and overlaps. So the use of clear notes and cross references helps to eliminate as much as possible these gaps and overlaps. Very, very helpful. I love them. All right. Vital records tags. In or out? I'm 50-50 on this one. I have a tough time with not putting these in. If there is a very good and healthy business continuity plan or disaster recovery plan that has lists of the vital records, then they don't really need to be in the classification system. However, I will say in my experience, the vast majority of organizations either do not have a BCP or DRP, or they ignore records management in their disaster recovery planning. So until that's resolved, I'm going to keep putting vital records in my classification systems. And I really want to point out this standard, Vital Records Programs. It's an ANSI ARMA standard, and I believe it's free, certainly free for ARMA members. Very helpful. It's very dense and very small font, which was irritating, but it's very, very helpful. And you would be surprised at the logic behind the fact that there is a lot more vital records than we thought there were, because they walk through the reasoning behind these things. All right. So I'm in and out, 50-50 on vital records. Routine release record identification and public use record identification. I don't think these need to be in the classification systems. They're first of all, they're so granular because we're talking actual records now, not file folders. Second, it's much more efficient to have a sheet of paper that lists these things. So if you have a reception area and somebody walks in and says, I understand you just approved a new contract, can I see it? They would see that approved contracts are routine release and they don't need to do an FOI request. I also love public use records where we have identified exactly where the record is, because a lot of times these get published on the website. So if somebody comes in and says, I'd like to see your annual report, you can say, well, it's on the website right there. Done, finished. Anything that doesn't fit under an RR or a PUR, that's when you either have to do a freedom of information request, or you really have to consider, I'm assuming you're a public body, or you have to consider whether it's something that would damage the organization, that sort of thing. I really like these things, but they don't belong in the records classification system. All right. PII and PIBs. In BC, we call them private personal information banks because that's in the FOI legislation. Out or in? Out or in? I have to admit, I'm leaning towards keeping these in the classification system. Usually because in order to maintain them, otherwise, you have to have a very good privacy officer who's watching these things and maintaining them. It would be awesome if you had both. So there's different reasons for having both. One is that in BC, you have to report on, or you have to maintain a list of your PIBs. And then just being able to identify them in the records classification system so that you know that records in this category need extra sensitivity. All right. Office of Primary Responsibility, or OPR, and security levels. Out. Back in the day, when we dealt with much more granular subject-based classification systems, it did make sense to have OPR and possibly even security levels embedded in the classification system. I really don't think it's appropriate anymore. To the point where even the BC government no longer actually tracks OPR because they've lost all control and of ability to track this sort of stuff. They've just given up, and OPR is another thing that really it's a nonsensical leftover thing from the 80s. Both of these, OPR and security levels, if you're talking about a broad functional classification system, they kind of lose meaning very quickly because there can be a wide range of offices or security levels within a single category. So, for example, agreements. There may be a wide variety of agreements. dealt with by all different offices. Committees, there's all kinds of committees, some with much higher security levels than other committees. A health and welfare committee, what do you call it? Health and safety committee. There's no security level to that at all. And the offices, every office might have a committee. So it's really not helpful anymore to try to maintain this sort of stuff in the classification system. There definitely should be a list. I strongly recommend you have a list of your committees and say who is the chair or the responsible for those committees, what are the security levels, that sort of thing. Highly recommend an external list to track all that sort of stuff. All right, so those are the bits and bobs. Let's move on to a very powerful aspect of records classification and retention schedules that, quite frankly, is the most ignored element. I very, very, very rarely are legal citations used in a proper and consistent manner. So let's talk about them. I think they're the third most important element. Obviously, classification and retention schedule. Those are the two. Coming in a third is legal citations. Okay. A legal citation connects a secondary to the legislation or regulations, or rarely some other official document. And this connection helps organizations to be compliant with the law by creating file folders and or records that automatically incorporate the legal requirements because we've identified them clearly and we've taken them into account when we built the classification system. I hope that makes sense, but we're gonna keep going. You can see that under the secondary, under accounting, we've got LC, which stands for legal citations, and then we have a number of legal citations related to accounting. All right, and in this case, we have BC 012. We've identified the code there, ACC-02, so they link backwards. This lower part is a separate table at the end of the classification system. So it's an appendix to the classification system. And the legislation in this case actually identifies the fact that when a municipality charges fees, they need to be able to show how they determine those fees. Okay, so if they charge you $800 for your electrical bill, they need to show you how they were able to come up with that $800 calculation. So that would be part of the accounting process. All right. Legal citation impacts. There are three ways that legislation or regulation may affect the records classification and retention schedule. The first way here is the rarest. It is extremely unusual, but paradoxically, it's the one that's most commonly known. A law or a regulation may say, thou shalt keep these records for this amount of time. So, of course, the most famous ones that we can think of are like the tax and pension plan acts, which say things like you must keep your accounting records for 6 years after the year in which they were created, whether it was a calendar year or a fiscal year. So very clear, 6 years after the year ends. Most commonly known, but it's a very rare thing for legislation to actually say, thou shalt keep for a certain amount of time. All right. In fact, number two here is by far the most common impact on your records classification system, and that is the requirement to actually create a record, or to provide access to a record, but that implies that the record has to be created. So some of the things that we would see would be safety and compliance regulations. Things that say you need to develop a safety plan, you need to develop a treatment plan, you need to develop a whatever sort of policy, you need to have a procedure for dealing with spills, you need to issue a report when an incident occurs, you need to maintain first aid records. All this sort of stuff is written in legislation, but it very, very, very rarely says how long you need to keep that record. It just says that you have to have one. The implication there, of course, is it sticks around until it's replaced by a newer one. And then you want to have a cushion of time to make sure that it's the old one sticks around long enough to support the function that it was designed for. All right. Some of these, I'm still on number 2 here. Some of these statutes also require that a document be posted in a conspicuous location, published on the internet, published in newspapers, or in the case of some certificates, they need to be kept in an inspected vehicle or in the possession of an individual with special training. And like I mentioned, there's provisions quite often for legislated authorities like officers or commissioners to come in and access certain records for their inspections or for their investigations, that sort of thing. For example, the BC childcare licensing regulation requires childcare records and other files related to the childcare facility to be kept at the care facility. All right. So the last way, number 3 here, this one is a very common one as well. The last way that legislation and regulations may influence a records classification system is by placing a limitation period on the records related to a certain action. Well, they don't worry about the records. They just say a limitation period on a certain action. So if you're trying to institute a claim, if you're trying to accuse somebody of something, there's a limitation period usually assigned to that. All right. And these limitation periods have an impact on the records that we're maintaining, because we generally need to keep these records as long as that limitation period exists, so that we can defend ourselves with evidence, with records, with all that sort of important stuff. All right. Not only is it very important to have these legal citations, it is very important to update them regularly. I would say for the vast majority of organizations, and this is not legal advice, but the vast majority of organizations, if you updated them annually, I update a lot of my clients in the middle of summer because Parliament is done and provincial legislature is done. So it's a good time while everything's calming down that you can go through and scour the legislation and regulations that have been created or amended over the last year. If you're in a high risk, highly regulated organization, you may want to be sitting on top of each change as it is approved and incorporating the effect into your classification system as it happens. But you're going to have some money to keep doing that. Many organizations, if they have legal citations, never update them. This is legally, you're in legal jeopardy doing this. I almost wonder if it's better not to have legal citations and just plead ignorance than to have some legal citations and just never update them. It's definitely not a good way of doing things. All right. Oops. Sticking with this one. Remember we saw earlier in the presentation the accountability payables for the BC government, and they had literally listed the Limitations Act that had been from 1996, and that was replaced way back in 2012, and it has never been updated. That is That's not good records management. All right. If you keep on top of this stuff, you may find yourself having a lovely surprise. It's not all gloom and doom. For example, in BC, payroll records, which included timesheets, had to be retained until an employee left the organization, plus a minimum of 2 years. So termination plus 2 years minimum. And since they're a financial record, that usually got bumped up to at least 6 years. This changed a number of years ago to a far more reasonable 4-year limitation or 4-year retention. This is one of those ones where they said specifically, keep it for 4 years after it's been created. Again, I would bump that up to 6 years after the end of the fiscal year, just to be in line with payroll, pension plans, income tax, all that sort of stuff. So the difference between those 2 years after retirement or 4 years after it was issued, dramatically different, especially if we're talking about timesheets. I have seen organizations where entire basements were filled with 80% timesheets, hundreds of boxes of timesheets sitting there. Now, if they don't know that this legislation has changed, they're still sitting there with a full basement full of timesheets. But if they knew, they'd be able to do a whole lot of shredding, make their lives a lot better. All right. That's all I wanted to touch on. More than enough, I'm sure. So let's move on, and we'll shut this down and do some questions.